All right, class, welcome. Module 3, the era of urbanization. Lots of kind of crossovers from the previous unit on the Industrial Revolution. Both of these take place in generally the same time frame, late 1800s, early 1900s. So, uh, some questions you should be able to answer. Externalities, we talked about that in the last unit in terms of industrial activity and urbanization. The idea that people are living in cities, millions and millions of people living in close proximity to one another, that's going to cause some externalities, both positive and negative. So we'll go through examples of that. How did urbanization affect the American economy, American politics? There's a lot of overlap between people that live in cities and how they vote versus people who live in rural areas and how they vote. Effects on American culture, we'll go over multiple examples of that, and effects on family life. We'll get to that in about 5 minutes, probably. That's a major one. So as urban areas expand, as cities get bigger, professional sports becomes a major cultural and economic influence. So this is probably common sense. In order to have a professional sports franchise, you need to have fans. You need to have customers. You need to have enough people to fill the seats. If you're going to invest tons of money in building a huge stadium, it wouldn't make any sense to do that in a rural area, right? It's common sense. You need it to be in a place where there are enough people to make it a viable business. There's enough fans, there's enough people that would want to buy tickets, and that's going to be where the people are, and that's going to be in the cities, right? So sports, there's nothing new about sports. So going all the way back to the ancient Greeks thousands of years ago with the Olympic Games, sports have always been a big part of culture. What changes here in this period is not the idea that certain people like to play sports. That's as old as culture. What is new and unique in this period and continues today is the idea that sports is not just something you do for fun, it can be a business. You can make a living. And now sports, I mean, it's a multi-billion dollar industry, as you know. That only begins slowly with the emergence of modern cities, because that's where the fan base would be to make it a viable business rather than just something you do for fun. How do sports reflect American society at large? So there's a certain theory about sports and whether you're a sports fan or not, if you've ever wondered why are sports so popular, one thing that is appealing about sports to a lot of people is that it is a meritocracy in a way that lots of other institutions are not. Um, in sports, sports are less corrupt than other parts of our culture from this point of view, okay? If you are the best player, the theory goes, it does not matter if you're rich, poor, doesn't matter if your parents were famous, doesn't matter if you're good looking, doesn't matter if your dad is friends with the coach. In sports, in theory, the best player, the person with the most merit, the most talent, will be successful regardless of where they come from or who they are or what they look like or anything else. And that's appealing to people. So how true that is up to you to assess, but that's something that's very appealing. The idea that the rules are the same for everybody, and if you're the best, you're going to be recognized as the best, even if you come from nowhere, right? Um, and that appeals to people. We'll also see later in the course, but just to jump ahead a little bit, because of the idea of merit and of talent rising to the top, regardless of every other social pressure that might exist, Major League Baseball was the first major institution in this country to end racial segregation with Jackie Robinson, as you probably know, who's actually in this photograph. And the idea behind that is not that the owners in Major League Baseball were somehow less racist than the rest of the society at large. The issue behind it was that the owners in Major League Baseball realized whether they're racist or not, if they exclude black players just because they're black, that's bad business. And if they include players based on merit, regardless of what they look like, they will beat their competition. All right. So there's that meritocracy thing coming into play again with the idea of sports. In terms of family life, during the 19th century, the 1800s, the average number of children in each American family was cut in half, from seven down to three and a half. Three and a half is still quite high. It's above what is known as replacement rates. Replacement rates, if we're studying demographics, if we're studying human population, replacement rate is the number of children that each family needs to have on average for the population to replace itself and remain steady over time. And it's two. Technically, it's 2.1, but let's simplify it. Let's say it's two. And here's the theory. You got mom and dad. If they have two children, they've replaced themselves, right? And so over time, the population will remain steady. If the average family has five children, the population of that society will grow quite rapidly, right? And conversely, if the average family has one child, well, over time, that society will disappear. It's very basic, all right? So if you look at demographics, if you look at birth rates around the world today, if you're interested in this, you want to look into this, there there are countries where people are not replacing themselves. Um, Specifically, most countries in Europe, um, Japan, South Korea, for different reasons, those people in those countries are not having enough babies. And that's their right, of course, but 100 years from now, I don't know what their plan is. Their societies will disappear. It's just basic biology, right? So what causes birth rates to decrease? Because in the American context, they decreased radically in the 1800s, and they continue to decrease to this day. There are economic reasons, social reasons, philosophical reasons, there are religious reasons. There's a lot that goes into this. One thing that changed during this period of American history, you can see this periodical here, birth control. Um, Birth control became, during this period and continuing today, much more effective, reliable, affordable than it had ever been before. All right. And if you have effective, reliable, affordable birth control, by definition, you're going to have fewer unplanned, unwanted pregnancies. And I'm not talking about abortion as birth control. Okay. This is way before that enters into the debate. We'll get to abortion later in the course. But the more birth control is universally available, obviously you're going to have less babies. That's one reason. Pretty straightforward, right? Religious reasons. All over the world, religious people of any religion, practicing Jews, practicing Muslims, practicing Christians, observant religious people, generally speaking, have more children than non-religious people. And as society becomes less religious, there are fewer children. All right, so we got birth control, we got declining religion. What else we got? Well, this unit is about urbanization on a very practical level. If you live out in a rural area with a bunch of land, you can have a bunch of kids. There's room, right? There's physical space, and you might need a bunch of kids to help you work the farm or whatever else. If you live, let's say, in an urban center, if you live in a little walk-up apartment in Brooklyn, practically speaking, how are you going to have seven kids? There's not enough space. All right. So cities are crowded. That's a very practical reason to not have as many children. So there's a lot of things that go into this: economic reasons, cultural reasons, religious reasons, just basic practicality reasons, all combine to lead to a declining birth rate. Now, whatever you make of that, you're probably too young to be thinking about kids yet, but it's literally the future. Okay. Demographics is destiny. Look around the world today. Who's having babies? That is the future. Those people and their ideas and their culture will dominate the future. And people who don't have kids, whatever their ideas are, whatever their values are, whatever they consider good, true, and beautiful and virtuous, those points of view will go extinct because they're not replacing themselves. All right. So if you want to expand this out and look into this for a current event, I am not in the business of predicting the future, but I'll do it this one time because this is easy. Look at the birth rates all around the world. The future will be significantly more African, Catholic, and Muslim, period. And the future will be significantly less white and secular slash atheist. That's what the data tells us right now. So demographics is destiny, important concept for you to think about. This is kind of a review of something we covered at the end of the last unit, so I don't want to dwell on this, but banning child labor, and then the flip side of that coin is what are the kids going to do? We're going to institute universal mandatory public education. What effect did this have on the economy? Well, as I covered briefly at the end of the last unit, number one, the adults got paid more because the supply of labor was reduced by removing children from the workforce. So the adults got paid more. So that's good for them. In terms of the kids, well, now for the first time in our history, every child gets at least some degree of education. You don't need to be able to pay out of pocket. So that opens up education to everybody, and that unlocks enormous amounts of potential, enormous amounts of intellectual capacity and capital. Because, look, there's a lot of very, very smart poor people out there. And if a society bases education on can you pay out of pocket, that's stupid because they're leaving a lot of potential undeveloped by saying to really, really smart poor kids, hey, you can't go to school. So the society, the economy, the literacy rates, everything starts exploding uh, for the better. Women's Christian temperance movement. This is an example of what's called civil society. We'll get to that in a minute. What did they do specifically? They were the first organization to identify and combat, quote, domestic violence. That wasn't a term before this group. Does that mean that there wasn't domestic violence? No, 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 of course not. Domestic violence was widespread throughout all human history and all cultures. What this group introduced is something that we now probably take for granted. The idea that domestic violence, a husband beating his wife, a wife beating her husband, which is much more common than you might think. Not that I would know, but I've seen the data. Men are very reluctant to report getting beat up by their wives. Spouse on spouse violence, parent on child violence, right? Domestic violence. Nothing new about that. What was new here was the idea that it wasn't a private concern, that it was actually the society's, the state's, the police's business. Okay. Prior to this kind of awakening of this issue, the idea that the police would be involved if a husband beat his wife was as ridiculous as it would be for you and I, the idea that the police would be called if, you know, a wife, uh, overcooks dinner. Oh, you overcooked the chicken. It's too dry. I'm calling the police. Well, that's ridiculous, right? That's not what the police are for. And domestic violence, believe it or not, was looked at in a similar way. People in a family, in a household, beating each other up behind closed doors. Society at large, the police had no role in that. That was considered private. And this pushed that issue into the public sphere. Pretty radical shift. They advocated for the prohibition of alcohol. They specifically linked abuse of alcohol with domestic violence, and that there's a lot of truth to that. That uh, abuse of alcohol very often leads to all kinds of negative things, up to and including domestic violence. Sure. They founded soup kitchens, free public libraries, and kindergartens. This is an example of civil society. It's a very important dynamic, especially in the United States. Civil society means it's a private group of individuals organizing to do something, to fix the problem as they identify it. In other words, it's not the government, it's civilians. It's not the government. This is a really unique tradition in this country. The idea that ordinary citizens, and you'll see a huge example of this in the civil rights movement. Who drove the civil rights movement? It wasn't the government. It was civil society. It was normal, everyday people identifying a problem and saying, we're not going to sit around and wait for the government to fix this. We're going to organize this and we're going to do this ourselves. It's a really important thing for you to consider. It's a huge part of our culture, much more so than in certain other countries. The idea that average, ordinary citizens can mobilize for whatever it is that's important to them and change society separate and apart from government action. United Daughters of the Confederacy. This is another example of civil society. This is not the government. These are ordinary civilians organizing to do something that's important to them. What was important to them? Promoting pride and what's called the lost cause. That's one of the terms that's used from the Southern perspective to refer to the Civil War. All right. Obviously, Southerners have a different narrative on the Civil War than Northerners do. And they, from the Southern point of view, it's a much more romantic, idealized view of what they were fighting for. And they had this term called the lost cause, right? It was a virtuous cause. We were the good guys, and it was a tragedy that we lost. Confederate statues and monuments were built throughout the South. And keep in mind, this isn't right after the Civil War. This is probably about 50 years after the Civil War. And what's up with that timing? Well, about 50 years after any war ends, you have a big wave of veterans of that war dying off from old age, right? Makes sense? And when that happens, the society will start to kind of revisit that war. For example, in the 1990s, mid 1990s, there was like an explosion of World War II books, movies, Saving Private Ryan, stuff like that. Um, because society started getting nostalgia for that era as the old men who fought in that war started dying off. So similar thing was happening here in the South about 50 years after the Civil War. We need to build statues. We need to build monuments. We need to do something to remember these people before they're all gone. History textbooks that were purchased for schools in the South praised the Confederacy and condemned Reconstruction. This you probably don't agree with that narrative, but it should make sense to you what their motive was, right? They wanted their children to be educated to think that they, the Confederates, were the good guys. So they're going to have a different perspective, and they are going to order textbooks that fit their worldview. And again, you might disagree with the specifics here, but this is a constant concern um, among people who are, involved in the education system. What are our kids being taught? And not just, math, right? Because 2 plus 2 is 4, regardless of where you live. But I mean subjective things like, especially history. What are they being taught? What textbooks? And this is pre-internet, right? So the textbook is the source of information. It's the only thing these kids are going to know is the textbook. That's power. If you control the narrative, that's power. And so these people wanted to educate or indoctrinate their kids in a certain point of view about history. So they're going to search out textbooks that support their point of view. It's natural. Whether it's a good, bad, or indifferent point of view, you should understand why that is. And there's a lot of power there. What are you being taught? Really important thing for you to think about. We'll get to some examples of that later in this course, because by the way, the the textbook that I used for this course that I didn't require you to buy, um, look, all textbooks are written by humans. Humans have biases, they have points of view, they have perspectives, totally natural, no problem. But you got to keep that in mind. As we move through the course, I will show you some quotes from the textbook I used in this course. And the textbook in this course has a bias. It has a clear point of view, which is fine, but it's something you need to be aware of. Social Darwinism, that came up briefly in the last unit in terms of business practices, and now it kind of expands into family planning, for example. Different terms of eugenics is kind of a term for controlling the population, who should have children, et cetera, et cetera. It was referred to as the science of human breeding. Half of American states, this might surprise you, passed laws to prevent, quote, mentally deficient people from reproducing. Wow. So again, survival of the fittest applied to people. And some social Darwinists just applied that to business. Some social Darwinists applied this to demographics. And they said, you know what? Certain people are not, quote, fit and therefore should not be reproducing because their children will also not be, quote, fit. All right, so this can lead to some pretty dark stuff, as we'll get to later in the course. As cities grew in size, new externalities, right, an outside effect of certain behavior. Cities have a lot of externalities, which led to a call for new regulations. Housing codes is an example of an externality. Well, it's an example of a regulation in response to an externality, I should say. Why does the government need to get involved in how buildings are constructed? Fire safeguards, indoor toilets, etc. Well, it's because in a city, there are externalities. If you build a house without indoor toilets in a city, there are externalities. What's the externality? Disease or just basic stink, because it's not just you, it's the huge numbers of people who live in close proximity to you. Right? If you live out in a rural area and don't have a toilet in your house, that's inconvenient, but it doesn't affect anyone else, you see? But in a crowded city, it will. It's a public health problem. Fire safeguards. If you don't have adequate fire safeguards in your farmhouse out in the middle of nowhere and your house burns down, that's a tragedy, but it doesn't affect anyone else, you see? But if you live in a big apartment building in New York City and your apartment catches on fire, it's no longer a private problem. It affects all of your neighbors. Does that make sense? So when people are living in close proximity, their behavior affects other people. That's the externality in a way that isn't true in a rural area. Okay. I live in a quite rural area. I'm on a big piece of land. Okay. I can do things on my property that if I lived in a crowded city, I would never be allowed to do. I got chickens running around. I can shoot guns in my yard. I can have big bonfires. I can basically do whatever I want because my neighbors are very far away. If I live in New York City and I walk out my back door and start popping off rounds and have chickens running around everywhere, no, 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 no. You can't do that. You can't do that. I'm affecting my neighbors. Those are externalities. So we're going to get to politics in a minute, but let me just preview this real quick. If you live in a city, other people's behavior affects you. The noise, the pollution, the whatever it is, right? A lot of externalities, a lot of people, and their behavior affects everyone else around them. And externalities require regulations, housing codes, noise ordinances, right? You can't start mowing your lawn at 4 o'clock in the morning, right? Little things like that. If you live in a city and you're surrounded by people whose behavior affects you, you are naturally going to want regulations. You're going to want more rules to make your life easier, right? And in terms of politics, we have two major parties, and which of them generally argues for more and more and more government action, regulations, rules, controls. Generally speaking, that's the Democrat Party. And people in urban centers, where there's lots of externalities and therefore lots of needs for regulations, who do they vote for overwhelmingly? They vote for Democrats. Does that make sense? And the party that, generally speaking, is more inclined to leave people alone relatively is the Republican Party, sort of. And so people out in rural areas who don't want a lot of government rules and controls over every little detail, well, they're generally going to vote for that party. Does that make sense? So these things affect uh, all manner of things, up to and including how people tend to vote in cities versus rural areas. By the 1910s, black music was achieving a central place in in American popular culture. That continues to this day. We can see all these genres of music over time, top to bottom, early to late. American music has been and still is disproportionately dominated by African Americans, just like sports, right? Similarity with music and sports. Another similarity between music and sports, it's not that people just started liking music or sports 100 years ago. No, 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 they're timeless. Music, sports, they're timeless. But just like sports, the idea that music wasn't just a hobby, wasn't just something you do for fun, the idea that music could be big business, the idea that you could become a multi millionaire playing a sport or playing an instrument, that's a new idea. And just like sports, what makes that possible? Well, if you live in a city with millions of people, that's enough people to fill a concert venue. Just like with sports, you need enough people to fill the stadium. So music and sports both shift from being just a hobby for some people to big business. The rise of great cities led to the building of museums, libraries, other things that, again, you're not going to build $1 million museum or a big, beautiful library in the middle of a cornfield. You need to build it where the people are. That's the cities. Andrew Carnegie, we talked about him last time, spent $33 million to build 1,000 libraries. That is the equivalent of $863 million in 2020. And if we calculate what it would be now due to the inflationary spiral in 2021, 22, 23, that's the equivalent now of over $1 trillion. Or I'm sorry, trillion, of over $1 billion. So Andrew Carnegie, good guy, bad guy, I don't know. A lot of people thought he was terrible and evil because he was a super aggressive businessman that crushed his competition. Sure did. He also donated $1 billion to build libraries for poor people. That seems nice. So how do you balance those two things? Vicious, cutthroat businessman also gave $1 billion for libraries for poor people. Libraries now for your generation are kind of antiquated. I get that. This is pre-internet, okay? Pre-internet. This is the internet. This would be the equivalent today of Carnegie buying with his own money high-speed internet connections for every person in this country free of charge. It's kind of a big deal, right? He's opening up a world of knowledge to people who otherwise might not be able to afford it. Media. We'll get to a couple other examples of this later in the course. Mass market newspapers emerge in major cities, and then radio stations and television stations, etc. News media in general, same as with museums, libraries, sports, music. you're not going to have a big, widely circulated newspaper in the middle of rural Montana. There aren't enough people. Where are the people? In the cities. Okay, so now we have big newspapers with, right, enough people buying the newspaper that the newspaper can afford to send people all around the world reporting on what's going on in the news. Okay, modern media. This raises the question, what is the job of the media? It's a timeless question. Is it their job to inform? Now, if you ask reporters, they will say, oh, yes, oh, of course, yes, yes. We are here to inform. We don't take sides. We're just here to give you the facts. Well, I will leave it to you to judge how good of a job they're doing at that. They would, of course, insist they're doing a fantastic job of informing the public. Is it the job of the media to entertain, to outrage? Because that's what sells. That's what sells. We know that. Outrage sells. Anger sells. Division sells. Right? Is it the media's job to unify? Well, I mean, if it is, they're doing a crap job. And it probably isn't their job, right? Because that sounds nice, unity, but unity behind what? We're all supposed to agree in a united way with what the media says. Kind of all set with that. But this is the question, right? We need information to make informed decisions, obviously, but entertainment and outrage, that's what sells, all right? Much more so than straight information. And the media knows that and they respond to those incentives. We'll get to some more examples of that later in the course. As cities expand, and like again, the segue between the last unit and this one, industrial cities. Industrial revolution leads to cities, right? They pose a serious problem of governance. Very complicated to govern a big city with millions of people and all kinds of externalities. Urban machines is a term that was used for how these cities were run. They dispensed jobs and patronage and arranged for urban services. When politicians made contracts for city services, some of the money ended up in their pockets. All right, let me give you an example. The guy in the photograph here, this is Buddy Cianci. He was the mayor of Providence, Rhode Island, where I grew up off and on from before I was born until I was in my 20s. Off and on. He occasionally had to leave office to go to prison, and then he would come back and get reelected. He is a more, late 1900s, early 2000s example of what they're talking about here. And so here's something that CNC did, mayor of Providence. He got a lot of stuff done. If you're familiar all with Providence, if you drive through Providence now, it looks very different than it did when I was a little kid. This is the guy that got Providence Place Mall built. He got Waterfire, right? When I was a little kid, the river in the middle of Providence, they had actually covered it up with big concrete slabs. They had like buried the river. He, kind of resurrected the river and turned it into this big, beautiful art installation thing. If you've ever been to Waterfire, he made the city more appealing, cleaner, more beautiful. He did. He was also insanely corrupt. When politicians made contracts for city services, some of the money ended up in their pockets. Here's an example of how these cities were run back then, and many cities still are. Here's something CNC did, for example. In a city in our part of the country, one of the city services that we need to put out contracts for is snow removal, right? It snows where we live, and we need our city to be able to plow the streets. And we do that by hiring a private company to do that job. We don't have city-owned plows and government employees plowing the streets. We have a private company do that. It's just more efficient that way, according to most people. Okay. And we're paying that contract, of course, with tax dollars. Fine. So the mayor in this example has to find a company that's going to plow the streets of Providence, Rhode Island in the winter. It's his job to find someone who's going to do a good job for a reasonable price, right? Because it's taxpayer money. Okay. Here's what he would do, CNC. He would ask companies for bids. And let's say there's two companies, one of them bids 10 million, one of them bids 12 million. Okay. And let's say they both are going to do an equally good job. And the mayor's job should be find someone who's going to do a good job. And in this hypothetical example, you got two companies, 10 million or 12 million. They're both going to do an equally good job. Well, who would you pick? You would pick 10 million, right? Because you want to save taxpayer money whenever possible. Why would you spend 12 million when you could get the same thing for 10? Well, CNC would go with the 12 million. Okay. So now that company that bid 12 million, they know they could have done it for 10, but they bid 12. Why would the mayor go with them? They're more expensive. Well, because what's going to happen in this example to that extra $2 million? Well, the company, let's say, takes a million of that 2 million and they just add that to their profit. So they're making more money. That's good for them. What about the other million that's left over in this example? Well, that goes to the mayor, who spends it on himself or gives it out to his friends or does whatever he wants with it. That's corrupt. It's very corrupt. He's stealing taxpayer money. And that's ultimately what the mayor of Providence went to prison for. Well, he went to prison several times for several things, but that was the last time, to be clear. Is that corrupt? Yes, it is. It is. But as someone who grew up in this city, I can tell you everyone knew he was corrupt. Nobody cared because the city was getting cleaner, safer, more beautiful. And then when he went to prison, we had a new mayor who was not corrupt, but was also not a good mayor, and the city went downhill. Machines were hard. This is a quote from the book. Machines were hardly perfect, but bosses dominated big city governments because they provided what was needed, and there were no condescending moral judgments. I'm not really sure what point they're trying to make there. They point out, though, they give a statistic. In 1900, Chicago, an insanely corrupt city then and now, Chicago provided more drinking water per day, a lot more than Berlin. Weird flex from the textbook. Why are we comparing Chicago to a city in Germany? I think the point they're making is that Chicago is very corrupt, but they provided a good service in the form of clean drinking water to its residents. Right? So that's kind of that, which is more important, corruption as a negative or providing good services as a positive, and how do you balance those out? This cartoon is more important here than the text. Here's what's going on in these cities during the time. Um, Naturalization mill. Naturalization has to do with immigration. This is a period that we're talking about here of huge levels of immigration, legal immigration, okay? We'll get to that more later in the course. Huge numbers of immigrants are coming to the United States during this period. What's going on in this cartoon? They are being naturalized, made into citizens, and so they're being fed into this machine that makes them citizens. And then after they come out of the machine, what do they turn into? What are these people collecting? Democratic voters. This is how this worked at the time. Huge number of immigrants would come in. Most of them would live in these cities. When they became citizens and were therefore able to vote, the huge majority of them would vote for Democrats. So the Democrat Party obviously had an incentive, a clear incentive, to make these people citizens as quickly as possible because they think they're going to vote for Democrats. Now, so this was one main pillar of the Democrat Party. until, we'll get to this later in the course, until the 1960s and 70s. But all during this period, recent immigrants, mostly from Ireland, Italy, who lived in cities, overwhelmingly voted for Democrats. That's one pillar of the Democrat Party. The other pillar of the Democrat Party was the white supremacists in the South. And in this cartoon, you can see upper left-hand corner, KKK, upper right-hand corner, African American being lynched. What are the two main pillars of the Democrat Party during this period, all the way through to the civil rights era? Two main groups of people, recent immigrants in northern cities and white supremacists in the South. That's what this cartoon is trying to illustrate. Documentary photography was new because photography was new. Jacob Riis is the most well-known, who documented a lot of the living conditions in these cities, which were intolerable by our standards. What was needed? What reforms and regulations were required because of all these externalities? Safe water. It's a public health issue. You need fresh water coming in, you need wastewater going out in the form of sewers in a city, because it's not just you, it's you and millions of your neighbors. There's externalities to unsanitary conditions in a way that there aren't in more rural areas. Garbage collection. The idea that the local government should be picking up people's trash. Now, again, I live in a rural area. My town does not pick up my trash. I have to hire a private company to do it. In a city, the local government picks up the trash. Why? Well, because I'm on a big piece of land. I could dump my trash on my own land. It's not going to affect anyone else. If you live in a city and don't remove your trash, let's say because you can't afford to hire a private company to do it, that's not just your problem. That creates a public health issue, externality for all of your neighbors. So the city has to do that. Stricter building codes, we talked about that earlier. If your house burns down, it's not just you, it's going to catch the house next door on fire because the houses are very close together. Clean public spaces. The most obvious example of that, Central Park in New York. You can look at this and very clearly see that it's not natural. It's, obviously a planned rectangle. And common sense will tell you, look, every other inch of Manhattan is built up, right? What did the developers and the investors and the real estate people say? Hey, you know what? Let's not develop this huge piece in the middle of the island. No, it was the city government that set aside and said, look, you are not touching this land. We need clean public spaces. So in a city, look, in New York City, there are parts of New York City, in Manhattan especially, where you could be outside all day and never be exposed to direct sunlight because the buildings are so tall. You are surrounded with glass and concrete and stone. And I don't know if you ever thought about this, that for all of human history, that's not how people lived. Um, we have always historically been in contact with nature in a way that now a lot of us aren't. And the idea behind clean public spaces like this is it is not physically, mentally, or spiritually healthy to not ever be able to have some peace and quiet. What do the kids say? Go touch grass. I love that quote. Go touch grass. Put the phone down, get off Instagram, go touch grass. If you live in Manhattan, it should be possible to have some peace and quiet, to listen to the birds, and to feel grass under your feet, to be in nature. That's the point of Central Park. And most cities have parks like this carved out for that reason. In rural areas, I don't need a park where I live. I'm on 10 acres. My yard is the park. If you live in an apartment in Manhattan, you need this set aside by the local government. Uh, Last thing is the crusade against prostitution in the cities accomplished its main goal, which was closing brothels, closing places that had legalized prostitution. All right. Now, with anything like this, there's a couple layers of assessing this that you should think about. Number one, do you personally approve of the behavior? Do you personally approve of prostitution? That's the base level thing. And a lot of people clearly in this period didn't on moral reasons. They thought prostitution was immoral. Fine. Next question. If you think something is immoral, should you make it illegal? It's a much more complicated question than it might sound like. What happened when they made open prostitution illegal? Did it end prostitution? Obviously not. It's called the oldest profession in the world for a reason. You're not going to end prostitution. If you make it illegal, you just move it underground, you put it into the black market, you make it inherently more dangerous. Okay? That worsened the conditions under which many prostitutes worked. There's going to be prostitution. You might hate it, fine. It's not going anywhere. So the question is, should it be legal, even if you don't like it and would never go participate in that? That's fine. Should it be carried out in a regulated, controlled, monitored environment? A building where the clients, shall we say, have to show identification and are filmed entering and leaving, and where the prostitutes are in a controlled environment? Or do you want this behavior happening, at an abandoned truck stop at 3 in the morning? Because it's going to happen regardless. The question is, do you want it to be legal and therefore regulated and controlled, or do you want it to be under the radar off the books? And if it is, that's way more dangerous for the prostitutes. Way more dangerous. They're very vulnerable people. Okay. There is a reason that serial killers tend to gravitate towards prostitutes. It's an incredibly dangerous profession. Um, and you can expand that out from the idea of victimless crimes. Some people say there's no such thing as a victimless crime, but the phrase refers to the idea that the big ones that are usually mentioned are prostitution, gambling, and drug use. There might be behavior that you personally disapprove of and would never participate in yourself. That's fine. But if someone is engaged in prostitution or in drug use, is there a victim? You might say the person engaging in the activity is victimizing themselves. You could make that argument. Let me add another layer to it. Are you free in this country to victimize yourself? Yes, you are. Yes, you are. Are you free in this country to eat nothing but Taco Bell? Yes, you are. It's not a good idea. And if you do that, you will be victimizing yourself, but you're free to do that, right? So if the idea behind a victimless crime is it might be bad behavior that's not good for you mentally, physically, emotionally, whatever else. But if no one's calling the cops, what's the crime? If someone goes to engage the services of a prostitute, you might disapprove of that. That's fine. Who's the victim? Does the prostitute call the police after their little exchange has been completed? Does the prostitute call the police and say, I'd like to commit a crime? I just accepted money for sex? No, that doesn't happen, right? Does the client, after they pay for sex, call the police and say, I'd like to commit a crime, report a crime. I just paid someone for sex? No, nobody's calling the cops. So was there a crime? That's the kind of the hypothetical question. It's a very tough balance, right? Because we have, look, there's a bar somewhere. We say now that prostitution's illegal. Okay. Pornography is the biggest economic driver on the internet, so good luck figuring that out. But prostitution's illegal. Fine. Heroin is illegal. Okay. Alcohol is legal. Cigarettes are legal. Mountain Dew is legal. Where do we draw the line? It's kind of arbitrary, right? Um, People are going to engage in unhealthy behavior, period. Should we criminalize it? Because when we do, that carries uh, lot of consequences that society needs to deal with. So big, really important topic for you to think about. So wrapping up, how did the rise of urban centers change the relationship between Americans and their government? If you live in a city, you expect more government involvement in your life in the form of regulations, etc. Just the nature of the beast. It's millions of people around. The government's going to be more involved in your day-to-day activity than if you lived in a rural area. Positive and negative externalities of urbanization, it's kind of subjective, but some positive ones. Look, if you live in a city, you have access to things you don't. If you live in the country, you have access to concert venues, sporting venues, museums, libraries, all kinds of different restaurants. It's exciting. Negative externalities, it's loud, it's dirty, there's crime. You know, you got to weigh those out, and is it worth it? The urban-rural divide, its effect on American politics and culture. I'll show you a map in a minute. Do I have it? Yes, I do. How did urbanization affect American sports, arts, and culture? It turned them all into big business rather than just something you do for fun. The urban-rural divide on American politics and culture. You're all familiar with the red and blue and the red state, blue state, and you got to be very careful. That red state, blue state thing is wildly oversimplified. Okay, extremely oversimplified. Um, for example, I live in southern Massachusetts. Massachusetts is a very, 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 very blue state, as you probably know. It's up there with Hawaii as the most liberal state in the country, right? My town in Massachusetts is super duper ultra mega MAGA. Very conservative town in a very liberal state. And conversely, there are very liberal towns in very conservative states. So be careful about oversimplifying red state, blue state, okay? What we see here on the map is not states, but counties. This is I want to say the 2016 election. Um, the last three elections, 2016, 20, and 24. If you look at counties that voted for President Trump, they increase every single time. The 2024 map will be even more red than this, but this is what we're looking at, so let's stick with this. If you don't understand American politics and geography, you would look at this map and you know, what's red, what's blue. I have no idea. It's a contest. It's an election. There's, team red and team blue. Who won? If you have no frame of reference, you look at this and you're like, well, team red got like 80% of the vote, right? No, no. The red areas, areas that vote more conservatively, are rural areas where there aren't huge concentrations of people. The blue areas, of which there are far fewer, right? But it's misleading because the blue areas have very dense concentrations of people. If you look at the Midwest, you see my cursor? Look at the Midwest, the area where Ohio, Pennsylvania, Indiana, that part of the country. It's most pronounced there, I think. You see, it's a sea of red with all these blue islands. See what I'm talking about? State of Ohio. Spent a lot of time there. My grandparents are from Ohio. State of Ohio is all red, but there are three blue dots. What are those three blue dots? Columbus, Cleveland, and Cincinnati. Three huge cities. Those three blue dots have more people than the much, much bigger red area surrounding it. You see what I'm saying? What you see in our politics in terms of the division, and it's quite divided, I'm sure you've noticed, if you had to boil it down to one single factor, well, there's probably two that are close to equally important. Factor number one, are you married? Regardless of race, gender, age, where you live, are you married? If the answer is yes, you are much more likely to vote for Republican. If you're not married, the chances are extremely high that you will vote for Democrats. The other predictive thing is, where do you live? If you live in a city, you are much more likely to vote for Democrats. If you live in a rural area, you're much more likely to vote for Republicans. So the era of urbanization leads to an explosion of all kinds of different things, good, bad, and indifferent. And it also becomes a pretty accurate predictor of how people tend to vote. All right, so I hope you got some ideas from this unit on some current events you might do, and I will see you next time.